begin, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Linux Foundation research program. Of course, the Linux Foundation is a nonprofit entity hosting the maintenance and development of the world's most critical software. And the research division is really here to tell that story of what it is that's going on across open source project environments, which industries are being transformed, which technologies are being adopted, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, and what we're aiming to achieve by creating research reports is making the open source communities more inclusive, encouraging more people to get involved as contributors, encouraging more organizations to support open source and open source foundations, and to really be a positive contributor on the whole to creating a knowledge network, a resource that is available to everybody publicly. So the work that we do is free and open, and if you scan that QR code, you'll go to Linux Foundation Research's homepage, where we have 18 research projects. 17 are on there now. I'm in the midst of publishing one in cloud technology on achieving resiliency in multi-cloud. But really, the Linux Foundation is in a unique position to produce research insights given its position in the open source ecosystem and the fact that this organization has a strong tradition of research excellence, highlighted by the Linux kernel history report and the FOSS contributor survey, which was run in 2020 in collaboration with Harvard University's Laboratory of Innovation Science. So please go to LF Research's home, download some of our reports, and let me know what you think. So what we're doing is looking at research along industry vertical lines. Here's an example of just some of the industries that we intend to investigate. We've been able to hit quite a few of them already, specifically in education and training, energy, financial services, media and entertainment. And we'll hope to cover all these different industries over the course of the program's running. We also would like to explore open source in terms of the different technologies that are being sustained. These tech horizontals include AI, ML, data and analytics, additive manufacturing or 3D printing, blockchain, cloud, so on and so forth. So that's another framework for how we approach researching open source project communities. We also look at issues and technologies that don't fit neatly into one particular horizontal or industry vertical, but rather that influence the success of the entire open source ecosystem. In particular, things like standards, software bill of materials being one example, or looking at issues around security, creating secure software supply chains. These are ecosystem-wide challenges. Same thing with diversity and inclusion. So that's a framework for how we go about analyzing opportunities and challenges in very broad areas. But what about regional open source dynamics? When we launched Linux Foundation Research in 2021, we created this three framework approach, but what we really didn't consider at the time was looking at open source through a geographic lens. And what we realized was that this is a very important way to explore open source dynamics. And so in May of this year, we launched a fourth framework, which is looking at open source from a geographic level, looking at global open source issues, continental open source activity, regional open source activity, and perhaps even at the country level or within a country, looking at something like Silicon Valley or the city of Toronto in Canada, what kinds of open source activities are taking place in these hubs of innovation. And we gave this geographic framework a name of its own. We're calling it World of Open Source, emphasizing really that while open source is an opportunity for the entire world, there are regional dynamics at play. And what we hope is that
innovation may take place within a region, but can be shared anywhere. One example in specific to Ireland, as well as Canada, was looking at an innovation that took place nationally. But when that IP was contributed to Linux Foundation, it created opportunities for everybody the world over. And this was specific to COVID notification applications, Green Shield being the example from Ireland. I believe it was implemented in the UK. And similarly in Canada, the team from Shopify, which is a technology company enabling e-commerce, they coded up a COVID notification app, and then subsequently donated that app to the government of Canada to roll out to all Canadians. And then they donated the IP to the Linux Foundation, where other countries could take advantage of that piece of technology. So where do we begin at this geographic level? Well, we had a few motivations on where we started in our first project. Namely, we needed to support the launch of the formation of Linux Foundation in Europe, and essentially create a research project that would explore open source trends in this region, knowing that we were going to increase our investment across the European continent, not just the European Union, but non-EU countries as well, like the UK, Iceland, and Norway, and so on, Switzerland being another excellent example. Having a better understanding of how the unique needs of the European community can be better served through data and insight. And we looked at things like consumption, or as some other people have chimed in, it should be called usage and not consumption. Don't like that term very much, but it's very often used. Looking at contribution, looking at things like leadership and governance, what's the level of policy, both the existence of policy and the understanding of that policy. Are there open source program offices? If so, where are they and how successful are they? What impact do those frameworks have on different aspects of open source activity? And then be able to identify leading industry sectors and the individual countries that are outliers, so that we can direct our energies and attention to better serving these communities and providing resources and education and tooling to further a flourishing open source ecosystem in Europe. So how did we go about this? First of all, we assembled a very important dream team. And I've had the pleasure of working with Colin in financial services research. He's extremely active in the FinTech and Open Source Foundation, lovingly referred to as FINOS or FINOS. And Colin brought in very capable team members to support this effort, Matt Dunderdale and Graham Odds. And really, we decided that Scott Logic was a terrific organization to lead this research effort in collaboration with LF Research. It really was a team effort, but it was important to us that we work with an entity on the European continent where command of both the technical aspects of open source, a solid understanding of open source dynamics was well established, as well as a high degree of fluency in the English language. So it's much more than ESL, it's having a high level of competency. So we were really thrilled when Colin and team agreed to take on this project, and we worked together with them on all elements of the research cycle. So in May, in partnership with the Scott Logic team, we launched a survey instrument. So immediately with Scott Logic, we worked on designing the survey questionnaire, the different sections of the survey, and we also identified other partners who could participate in this process, making sure research is a collaborative effort, giving other organizations the opportunity to get involved, and also to help us achieve as robust a survey respondent pool as possible. And so together we recruited the distribution partners that you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen. If it's blocked by my camera, I'll just read them out. Code Motion is a developer community. ISAID is a Spanish academic institution. FAU stands for Friedrich Alexander University, based in Nuremberg, Germany. The FINOS community is one of the LF Financial Services Project communities. Both IGOP and UAB are a Barcelona-based technology university, I should say. Linux Foundation Public Health had some excellent contacts in Europe. They were terrific in helping us reach people in Ireland as well as Switzerland. LF Training and Certification, they have a massive network globally of all who they create and manage the education and training programs, both free courseware as well as paid certifications. And they have a very active European subscriber base. Open Forum Europe were with us from the get-go in terms of helping us network with the public sector. To Do Group has a Europe chapter. To Do is the group at the Linux Foundation that looks after the value proposition around open source program offices. We had Technology University Berlin, Technology University at Eindhoven, Sailboard, which is the Dutch incubator, the Scott Logic team, of course, and the University of Southampton. And altogether, this group was responsible for our ability to have more than 1,000 survey starts. So we'll get into the specifics on respondents, but I should say that the survey was launched in Europe, and the results were published also in Europe, launched in Valencia, Spain on the 17th of May. Now, why can't I move my screen forward? Here we go. Give me a minute. Right then. Okay, back in business. Survey distribution partners, we had a total of 16. Already mentioned, their profile and what they were, how the kinds of communities we were able to leverage through their participation. The screening criteria we used was that we use bot screeners because we do tend to get a high amount of bot traffic. And so having a few questions that ensure that our respondents are indeed real people is top priority. European resident was an obviously important screener. Our respondents needed to be at least part-time employed, and they had to have knowledge of their employer's approach to open source. I'll continue with a little bit more methodology. We fielded the survey for 6 weeks, beginning in May. We had 1,050 survey starts, European respondents who qualified for the survey, 750 completed questions pertaining to open source consumption, 670 completed the survey from beginning to end. So a very decent sample size, allowing us to do some interesting analysis. 16 interviews with subject matter experts from a cross-section of the European ecosystem, public sector, private sector, and academia combined. So we had a lot of really rich insight into what was happening by both this quantitative and qualitative approach to telling the story. So our key findings. What we learned in the process specific to the survey is that when we compare the extent to which open source consumption is permitted, it varies according to the respondent's organization's size. So organizational policy does encourage open source consumption, and the bigger the organization is, the more likely it is to attach limiting conditions. So you can see on the left, organizations with fewer than 10 employees, open source consumption is openly encouraged, and then those numbers decrease as the size of the organization increases. In terms of contribution back upstream, there are indeed variations in contribution policy, and they vary also according to organizational sector. The sectors which are, I suppose you could call them laggards behind everybody else, are public sector, education, and financial services or finance and insurance. 29%, 28%, and 25% compared to more encouraging policies for the IT industry, for scientific and tech services, and for telecom. And again, the public sector, the education sector, and the financial services sector don't have clear policies on open source contributions. So there are two areas for improvement in those three sectors. We need to work on not just policy formation, but awareness of those policies across those industries, and broadening the understanding of the value proposition for increasing overall contributions to open source. Now, when we look at individual countries and how and whether open source is deemed to be important, we see that there's a lot of agreement in these top countries: Germany, Netherlands, the UK at the top, and then France, Italy, and Spain at the bottom of this sort of agreement range. This respondent pool is a high degree of consensus that open source is very important to the respondent's individual sector. However, as we go along the scale and we look at things like consumption being encouraged and contribution being encouraged, the agreement tends to fall in linear fashion. I think what's interesting is Spain being at the low end of this pack. We had a very good number of survey partners in Spain. Why it lags behind in terms of these numbers is not really clear, and it creates an opportunity for us to do more work. And here the UK contribution is encouraged by policy, is more prevalent. So it's a very interesting view of which countries stand out and have a high degree of agreement about open source being important, consumption being encouraged at what level, and contribution being encouraged as well. So that imbalance needs to be addressed so that we can make sure that open source remains a sustainable phenomenon in Europe, and hopefully our efforts will help change some of these findings in future studies. In terms of leadership, there is a definite relationship between an open source program office or having a visible leader in open source strategy and open source consumption being encouraged. The presence and permissiveness of a consumption policy at the respondent's organization really does relate to the presence or clear absence of a visible leader. So OSPOs really matter, and leadership really matters on consumption. In terms of perceived changes in the value derived from open source vis-a-vis open source strategy, an OSPO or a clear leader is more likely to have a strategy, like it increasing significantly, almost double over respondents where there was neither an open source program office nor a clear and visible leader defining strategy for that organization. To conclude, what we learned in this exercise was the need to address that imbalance between consumption and contribution. how do we work with some of these laggard organizations to provide encouraging or the existence of policies, the awareness of policies, and encourage more the likelihood of more upstream contribution, and create that clarity through clear leadership, whether that is at the OSPO level or having somebody within an organization to take on that role individually. Other conclusions we found: encouraging the public sector to really leverage the open source opportunity, and also embrace open source as a mechanism for innovation, and to see it as an apolitical, neutral arena to innovate, and for those innovations to go on to become standards that can have a global impact, not just for the country or the region in Europe, but can really shape success stories for other geographic regions. So here, I'll invite you to scan the QR code to download the report and dig into the excellent work by the Scott Logic team. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to help answer them now or at any time. And I believe Colin would invite likewise. So thank you. I'll be very happy to take questions. Maybe I'll stop sharing my screen. How does that sound?
Thank you so much, Hilary. That was really good. Yeah, an interesting one I think is the public sector. I don't know if you're aware, but within the UK, the UK government has got quite a progressive and prescriptive approach to open source. Pretty much it's open source by default. You need a reason not to be open source, yet the survey findings show that the people actually doing the work on the ground just have a lack of policy, a lack of understanding. They've been given this mandate, but they don't know how to enact it. So that, to me, was a really interesting result. Do we have any questions from anyone? Yeah, go for it.
I was surprised to see the financial industry as a low consumer / contributor to open source. I'm wondering what your thoughts on that are. Perhaps just because it's a regulated industry, although from my experience I have worked with customers in the financial industry, so just wondering, statistically speaking, why are they more likely on the lower end of consumption compared to some of the others in the IT industry?
Great question, thank you.
Yeah, so yeah, I'll have a go, and Colin, feel free to top up my reply. But as I understood the question, why is it that financial services is ranking so low in terms of the upstream contribution policies? And really, it comes down to it being a highly regulated industry, very much like healthcare, and having similar concerns as the public sector about risk. And this idea of risk management, this fear of leaking intellectual property, a fear of non-compliance with the financial regulators. And this goes so far into community chat environments and project documentation, GitHub chats, and so on, that could potentially be troublesome for securities regulators or financial regulators. And that's why the default is manage the risk and therefore don't permit the upstream contribution. Colin?
Yeah, we actually worked on a separate study specifically for financial services. I'm trying to remember the result, but the one that just jumped out at me was the greatest inhibitor for those working in financial services was a fear of leaking IP. That is the one thing that's holding them back from contributing to open source. But as someone who kind of works on the cold face, I'd say that's a pretty ridiculous conclusion, because the vast majority of open source technology they use are things like Kubernetes and Kafka. How is a bank going to accidentally leak IP into Kubernetes? It's just not going to happen. So I think there's a lot of education that needs to take place, because I think their fears are based on some pretty big misunderstandings in my mind.
What was also interesting from the study that Colin and I worked on specific to financial services was the fact that 46% of survey respondents had policies in place that not just prohibited contributions to open source projects that related to their employer, but also any project that was of interest to the developer in their personal time. So very, very restrictive policies. So yeah, we have lots of work to do in whether it's hosting roundtables, finding out what the core concerns are, helping overcome this issue of fear of leaking IP. It does help us inform our programming.
I like to see it as an opportunity.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Hi, my name is Musab. Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a similar question to what my colleague has asked in regards to the organisations. As they get bigger, they seem less open to open source. Is that similar? Is it similar to the? Is it the reason because of IP? That's the first question. The second question is there any plans for future research that the Linux Foundation is going to be conducting?
Okay, very good question on as the organization gets bigger, it becomes less supportive, I suppose, to summarize open source. I had a very interesting interview with one of the world's largest financial services organizations, whereby it was disclosed that of their technology stack, 99% was estimated to use open source. And so in terms of usage and consumption, it's very much part of a competitive strategy. It's when we get looking at clarity around what that policy is or making upstream contributions. So it's how we look at open source within large organizations. They love open source for the ability to leverage the software, but how they engage with open source project communities is very different as organizations increase in size. Many organizations, certainly in financial services, see it as an absolute imperative to their technology stacks. So they like what they get from it. It's just managing that consumption in a more effective way and encouraging the sustainability of that software through shared collaboration in development and the implementation of things like security best practices. That's what we need to work on so that we leverage, otherwise it's free ridership. It's a one-way street where open source is starting here and going there and there's nothing coming back. And that's a lost opportunity. So that's what we want to change in further engaging large organizations to leverage their talents and help them at the same time attract top employees by giving those developers the opportunity to work on open source projects.
Yeah, I came into the survey thinking it was going to be small organisations would be permissive, larger organisations would be less permissive. What we actually found was, yes, smaller organisations are highly permissive, and the very largest of organisations, it's not about permissive, it's more about policy. What was very interesting was the ones that sat in between, they had the greatest number of respondents that said, I don't know, or there's no clear policy. Small organisations, there wasn't a policy, but there was that can-do attitude. On the very large organisations, there were policies in place. People, whether they're restrictive or otherwise, people know what they're doing. To me, the great opportunity is the small to medium-sized organisations where people just don't know what's permitted. They don't know what they should do, which again, I see as an opportunity. I mean, changing the minds of the larger organisations, that's going to take time and effort, but at least creating some clarity, that's something that can hopefully be addressed in a shorter period of time. I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks once again, Hilary. Thanks for some great questions. Very much appreciated. Quick round of applause for Hilary.
Thank you.